The criminal must be someone mentioned in the early part of the story, but must not be anyone whose thoughts the reader has been allowed to follow. All supernatural and preternatural agencies are ruled out as a matter of course. Not more than one secret room or passage is allowable, and such a passage may only be in a house or building for which it is appropriate by age or purpose. These rules I've just mentioned are the first 3 that appear in the Knox Decalogue, a set of rules codified by Father Ronald Knox in 1928, that both described the traditional plot devices used in detective fiction, specifically in whodunit mysteries, and informed future writers how to write detective fiction well, at least according to Father Ronald Knox. But I am not Father Ronald Knox. I'm sorry for this transition. I'm not Father Ronald Knox, I'm Simon from Games Deconstructed. And when I don't play card games, I tend to play detective games. I play quite a lot of them actually. And in the process of going through each and every Steam listing having to do with the word detective or mystery, I've noticed something very peculiar happening. At first, I noticed it unconsciously, with the process becoming more realized in my eyes as I went through more of the games I found. I started dividing them into 2 distinct categories. Games where I, personally, as the player, feel like a detective, and games that are about detectives but do not necessarily provide me with the same experience. Now, bear in mind this is not a value judgment, I enjoy games from both categories, it's just that they provide me with a different kind of fun, and I think that's interesting. I think that's interesting because it often comes as a surprise, because members of both groups are initially presented in a very similar way, especially marketing-wise. They seem to be offering a sort of cerebral enjoyment of applying deductive reasoning to a mystery scenario and solving it through detailed analysis and interpretation of clues, or you could call it detective work, I guess, these of you who don't have a complicated relationship with the thesaurus. Now, even though members of both groups are marketed similarly, I don't think it's false advertising, and I don't think some of these games are badly designed either. I just think that there are some unspoken assumptions about detective games, about mystery games, about detective stories in general, and they ought to be spoken about at length and categorized. And that's what I intend to do in this video. I will try to keep spoilers to a minimum, of course. I know that's a point of contention when talking about detective games, so I will only present footage from the first parts of each game. So to solve this particular mystery, we need to come back to the origin of mystery stories. Literature. See, the Knox Decalogue fits into this, I promise. Fairplay mysteries, or fairplay whodunits, have the interesting characteristic that they are a mystery not only to the characters within the story, but also to the reader. The solution to the mystery is obfuscated by the author utilizing a number of literary techniques. One of the ways in which information may be obscured is through a bad noise-to-signal ratio. More elements will be introduced than are vitally necessary to solving the mystery. Red herrings, multiple suspects, unimportant set dressing presented alongside vital clues are just some of the ideas. Compatible clues will be most often spread throughout the story, so that it's more difficult for the reader to combine the ones that connect, at least until the detective points out the similarity. For example, you may have one of the suspects have red mud on their shoes on page 3, and the culprit's hideout on page 300 have streaks of similar mud. To present a simplified example. Knox's first rule plays perfectly into that. The criminal must be someone mentioned in the early part of the story, but not anyone whose thoughts the reader has been allowed to follow. So this creates a good climax through the use of the literary technique called foreshadowing. Now, in the general process of interaction between the reader and the detective within the story, is that the reader follows the detective along as the detective solves the mystery, and they may or may not solve the mystery in parallel with the detective character. Now, if they don't, they just absorb the story's content passively, and they are presented with the solution when the detective comes to it. Usually at the climax of the book, and maybe in the form of a parlor scene. If they do, however, try to solve the mystery alongside the detective, they should theoretically be able to solve it before the climax, though the author will often take steps to make that intentionally difficult. It's sort of a balancing act between not making the story too easy to solve early, thus ruining the climax, and also making it seem, at least in retrospect, like it was always solvable for the viewer or reader. Now, bear in mind that even though the roles of the detective and the reader may appear similar, they are only superficially so. Forgot which one was the detective. One, the detective analyzes the clues, while the other, the reader, analyzes a textual description, a literary description of the clues, and that's very different. For example, the detective may physically see, using their eyes, something stick out at a crime scene, while the reader may see something stick out in a description, in the author's use of language, and those modes of observation are starkly different, even though they appear similar. In more cases than one, I'd argue that the reader competes more with the author, with their use of language, than with the detective character. You're not fighting Sherlock Holmes, you're fighting Arthur Conan Doyle, if we were to present that as fighting. Almost like you would in a game. And indeed, the writer John Dixon Carr called detective fiction along this vein the grandest game in the world. Now, we have to keep in mind that this paradigm is not vitally necessary in good detective stories. You can write good detective stories without this sort of minigame, but it was central to the genre for so very long with Arthur Conan Doyle, Agatha Christie, and what have you. And it's very recognizable and very internally sound. So it creates an expectation in the viewer, even if it's a subconscious expectation. When I hear detective fiction, I immediately think whodunits. Your mileage on that trend may vary, of course. If you're emphatically into, say, Nordic crime literature, you might veer more towards Nordic noir than Sherlock Holmes, but in my case, when I hear detective, I think Sherlock Holmes. I think Poirot. There are, of course, examples of detective stories that do not utilize this paradigm. Let's say hard-boiled detective stuff, Chandler. And in this case, the main technique here is portioned information. Let's say there is a door, and in this door there is a beautiful striking woman, and in the woman's hand there is a smoking gun. Now, this short paragraph would of course be a full-length novel in most cases, but it doesn't bother itself functionally with convincing me that I could have figured out that the woman had a gun before I was told she had a gun. I find out about the smoking gun when the story tells me about the smoking gun, and the implications of it being in the woman's hand should be clear then and there. At least superficially, of course, because we have to consider the possibility of a twist. But the portioning of information along the well-paced story is the main thing in hard-boiled fiction. And just these two subgenres have created a multitude of connected tropes and elements. And games are very good at replicating tropes and elements from other genres. Be they visuals, sound design, narrative elements, themes, etc. And these tropes, the tropes of detective fiction, are very easily recognizable. Let us consider Knox's Decalogue again. It has rules about secret passages, identical twins, Chinamen for some reason, and the detective's stupid friend. Those are hyper-specific plot elements. Hyper-specific, I tell you. If you use one of them, just one of them, In a game, in the slightest sense, have someone use the phrase locked room mystery, for example, or have a butler be one of the suspects, have there be a secret passage in an old manor, you are immediately inviting the viewer, the player, to assume that the other genre conventions will be observed, or at least that you will explain their absence in some way. And that's a heavy burden for your work of art to carry, especially if you took it on without realizing. The game in question will have to carry the cross of having attached the assumptions that it will provide a similar sort of experience to a detective novel. And of course, since most of the genre examples are very concerned with pacing, it will also have to present a properly dramatic payoff. Maybe in the form of a parlor scene if you want to be very classic. It will have to make use of foreshadowing, etc., etc. Make note of these two characteristics, as they will come in handy during later parts of the video. Now, as we move along to detective games, we find them conceptually in a sort of weird limbo. Some of them are presented as merging the roles of the detective and the player. Now you can be the detective, they seem to say. In other cases, they emphasize the following along nature of detective stories. They seem to both want to transform the familiar experience of literary whodunits and keep its core unchanged at the same time. And that's heckin' difficult. So in many cases, a detective game is still about following a detective along, but now it's in a different medium, making the role of the reader, now the player, very different. And they are given different elements to interact with. In comparison to a book's writer, a game developer has a different selection of tools at their disposal that they use to deliver a satisfying experience and payoff to the story. Models and event flags instead of literary devices and narrative techniques, if you will. But I would like to consider here the medium's impact on the story and how that relates to the expectations players have based on their past experiences with different detective stories that may share some similarities, at least superficially. So, books and movies versus games. There is a similarity to solving a detective story to a game. And I feel like there is an unspoken expectation that if this experience is superficially similar, it will easily translate into the medium of video games. Because after all, one is kind of like a game and the other is a game. So how hard can it be? It can be hard. Problem number 1. The incompatibility of tools of expression. It is important to be conscious of how medium characteristics influence the effectiveness of modes of expression that are used. For example, foreshadowing that we've discussed before needs some time to sink in. You need to have the initial information, the fading of it into the background, which needs a bit of time, and then a moment of joyful reminding, a joyful reunification with the information upon its significance being realized by the viewer, player, reader. And that needs time, so it's going to be easier to find that sequence, at least find it used well, in a 300-page novel, for example, than in a 4-verse limerick. If you know of a 4-verse limerick that uses foreshadowing really well, just put it in the comments, like I will personally congratulate you. So, some techniques that are useful in film, that are useful in literature, are going to be more difficult to use, and some are going to be easier in a game. I'm going to give a small example right now, but to be frank, all the upcoming parts of the video will build upon this concept in some way. That detective games often find it difficult to use detective modes of expression in a game setting, or find it difficult to use gaming modes of expression in a detective setting. I've mentioned before that one of the key concepts in fair play mysteries is the difficulty of gauging what elements are important to the story and which are just set dressing, just parts of the world, what's signal and what's noise, in other words. But objects in games mostly start to exist when interacted with. There is a clear split, a functional split, between interactable important stuff that gets added to your inventory and uninteractable background elements. Therefore, it is implied to the player that if an object is interactable, if it's added to the inventory, if it lights up on your detective vision when you press X, it's going to be important, it's going to be useful in some way. Chekhov's gun, bomb. Thus, it's going to be much more clear which elements are important to solving the mystery and which are just set dressing. And of course, you may add a small red herring here or there, but it's hardly scalable. Because it's possible, it's much easier to read a description of a room's contents that has 10 elements, 9 of which are unimportant and 1 is key for the mystery. But if you were to play that out in a game, with each object being uninteractable, it would look something like this. Nothing here. Nothing of note. Yes, unimportant garbage. I don't think that's connected to the murder. And that sequence, having to interact with each of these objects only to be informed that they are unimportant, would wholly kill my enjoyment as a player. Hence, the technique is less effective, and ways of trying to increase that effectiveness are dangerous for player enjoyment. And that's why it's important to realize why some tried and true techniques that work in literature or film may not benefit from a one-to-one translation into the game medium. Problem number 2. Pacing. Pacing in games is very often dictated by player progress. Now, this makes it a bit harder to recreate the tension leading to the revelatory climax that's present in fair play mysteries. Because in a book, the detective will often solve the mystery even if the reader doesn't. We talked about this, solving in parallel and all that. Considering that there is a sort of a competitive relationship between the two, this makes those mysteries sort of have a soft timer. If you finish the book before solving the mystery, you will be spoiled on the answer. But most games want/need a failure state. And in the case of detective games, in the case of mysteries, the most popular failure state is just not progressing the story until you figure something out. Some games that I consider capital D detective games, like The Return of the Obra Dinn or The Case of the Golden Idol, have mechanics to help the player along in a non-diegetic way, so without being perceivable by the characters in the story. They just smooth over any potential roadblocks you might have to make sure that you are not stopped in your tracks midway through the story, which would kill the pacing. And that's difficult to do diegetically. If the character tells you the answer at some point, it just feels patronizing. Like if Sherlock Holmes tells you, "Hey, you should probably check this out," you feel like Watson and not Holmes anymore. And that's why I prefer to solve this particular conundrum non-diegetically, with mechanics like Obra Dinn's confirming when you have 3 correct people on your sort of clue board, or Case of the Golden Idols, you have less than 2 wrong answers prompt. It is of course gamey, and some players are likely to be pulled out of the narrative by that. And it's not going to be ideal for them, but I enjoy it, and here's why. These systems, they sort of give you a framework as a player, but the answers still feel earned when you complete the task, and that's satisfying for me from a gamist perspective. At the same time, on the narrative side, it helps smooth over the pacing difficulties, the potential roadblocks, so I look at this mechanic with a sense of respect for its functional excellence, like one would look at an ergonomic chair, for example. It's useful, even if it's not the most elegant thing you've seen. Problem number 3. The player character. First and third person games often lead the player to assume that the player character is an extension of themselves in some way. That's why when you in a detective game present a solution to a mystery or part of a mystery that hinges on the detective's interpretation and not the player's, that can be immersion breaking. Because either parts of the mystery have to be obscured from the player but not the character, and that doesn't feel fair play, or it can cause a jarring dissonance, because realizing that you are responsible for the character when walking, but their line of thinking is divorced from yours, is immersion breaking as hell. Now, there are games about detectives and related characters that, even though they make me aware of this disconnect in my thinking and the character's thinking, that I still enjoy, and that's pretty much every single Ace Attorney game. I feel so disattached from the characters, be they Phoenix, Apollo, Naruhodo, or Athena. I always feel that their decision making is either faster or slower than mine, that they are approaching the problem from a different perspective, and I just don't feel like they are me, but it's not a problem because I approach the game from the perspective that the character is going to be different from me. But in terms of successful self-insert characters, I've made an interesting observation about some of the games that I consider detective games. Payne's Creek Killings, for example, has a very subdued main character. She's a journalist and a framing device. Golden Idol has no player character whatsoever. Obra Dinn has a cardboard cutout of a character. They are voice acted, they say like 3 sentences during the game, and they are outside of the events taking place. They have a plot-related reason to be there, but they do not interact with the characters because of how the plot is structured. These blank slate characters make it much easier for the player to imagine themselves as part of the story, and I think in delivering that "now you're the detective" experience, that's very important. Problem number 4. Scope. Now, detective work in the real world, based on what little information I have on it, is a rather varied endeavor. Like, you have to check in with various sources, you have to come up with proactive ideas on how to solve problems, and in terms of how you approach cases, every case is going to be somewhat different. And games about detectives will often try to give you a simulationist taste of what detective work in the real world could be like. For example, by introducing an archive in which you can check stuff about suspects, or by including an interrogation system with some sort of mechanic that makes it easier to break suspects. But including these subsystems, while I think simulationist elements are great when it comes to "now you're the detective" type of narrative conceits, is that they are, in most cases, only useful in select situations during the cases. And that sort of presents a clash with player expectations after they're introduced to them. For example, if I can look up the guy's address in case 1, why can I not do that in case 3? It's established as something both I, the player, can do and my character can do. Why can I not ask random people on the street if they heard something? If I was able to trip up a witness with a surprise question in case 4, why can't I attempt to do it in case 5? Why is my selection of predetermined questions I can ask during the interview comprised of these questions and not that question? It was so useful in case 4. So my point here is that if you provide the player with a taste of a simulation of some part of detective work, they're going to want the whole thing, basically. So the best detective games intentionally limit the scope in regards to the systems that a player is given access to and the capabilities of the player character. You are not going to do everything a real-life detective could do. And in most cases that's accomplished diegetically, so your character will have some narrative reason for why they cannot do everything. For example, in Golden Idol, you are not a detective. Your abilities are to move elements, words of appropriate color, from the bottom panel to one or more blank spots on the board above. That's it. You can go back to previous cases if need be, it's sometimes useful. but there are no external archives, no places to look up clues, no interrogation, no proactive problem solving. You are limited to the tool you are given. So diegetically within the game world, you don't exist. You are an ethereal observer of a static scene with no influence on what's happening, no ability to ask the character questions, no ability to judge the veracity of their answers, and I think that's good. Similarly, in Obra Dinn, where you are a character in a game world, but all the events that you are looking at took place in the past. You are only able to see glimpses, and all the characters you see are dead and gone. You are unable to influence them, you are unable to trip them up, ask them to reveal further information, etc, etc. That means all you can do as the character is to perceive the echoes of the moments of their death, and as the players you can do both that and write down answers in your answer book, choosing from appropriate sets regarding the cause of death, potential killer, and the identity of their character. These are excellent because they either find a player reason or an in-universe reason for limiting the things that you as the player can do. The developers would not be able to simulate every decision that you would like to make in something as freeform as a detective investigation, but they might be able to simulate being a detective in an investigation that is frozen in time, or an investigation where nobody can talk. And imposing this sort of limitation, narrative or not, is very useful to make sure that you do not bring the player out of immersion. Now, I think it's worth a segue to mention that detective literature also used limitations, in-universe limitations, to make their stories make more sense, essentially. They used it as a tool. Harsh weather, stranding all the suspects within the country manor and cutting off phone access, for example. That's an idea that limits the more off-the-wall ideas about solving the mystery that the readers may have, and it sort of funnels them towards the way the author intended for them to solve the mystery. I think that's useful when planning a mystery story. Now, let's head towards the solutions part of the video. Is it possible to present in game form a story in which the player is going to feel like a detective? I think it is, and I hope to tell you how. First of all, the use of deductive reasoning, popularized by the Sherlock Holmes stories, really makes the player feel like they are solving the mystery like a detective would. Sherlock Holmes, in particular, being the detective. And there are some game mechanics that do this very well. Anything where you have to complete an event sequence in time, like the comics in Danganronpa, or for example choosing the culprit and combining all the clues into one coherent story like you would in the end parts of each investigation in the Sherlock Holmes games. Another part is determining what's signal and what's noise. As interesting as it was within mystery literature, it's also interesting in the mystery detective games. For example, in the case of the return of Obra Dinn, the developer Lucas Pope did an incredible job with modeling up which parts of the story are important for solving it and which parts are set dressing. During my playthrough, I discounted some parts of the ship, of the scenery, as wholly unimportant, while my friends, who I watched play the game later, because I love it, and you should play it if you haven't, have gleaned information from these same parts of the scenery that I discounted as unimportant, using their knowledge of characters' habits and knowledge of, naval organization that I was unfamiliar with, to make judgments about the characters based on set dressing, what was essentially set dressing for me. And I think the game does a marvelous job at never really delineating clearly which are the important elements and which are not. And this allows you to feel like you are actually gleaning contextual information, realizing what's important by yourself and not just smashing the interactable objects together, which I dislike, especially when I can't figure it out. Finally, determining the implications of this signal yourself. I think that's a big one. For example, if this character has doctor's tools, I think that they are a doctor. And this piece of paper talks about a doctor, so I think this character is this person. That's better than a character telling me these implications. Hey, if this character has doctor's tools, I think they are Dr. X. And even if the deduction here was kind of simple, I still feel like I am personally responsible for making this deduction. And this is what Case of the Golden Idol is built upon, actually, and this example comes from its tutorial. You should also play it, it's also excellent, just like Obra Dinn. So, in summation, there is a real problem with being able to make players feel like they are doing actual detective work in a game while still keeping the game fun. And I think several aspects of this problem have to be realized so that we may be more clear on what type of experience a particular game is presenting. The solutions are twofold. First, both the players and the developers have to acknowledge that various media are different, and telling a particular sort of story in a different medium may not be as easy or as difficult as it would be in a different medium. So attempting to gamify, quote-unquote, a fair play mystery is not going to be easy one-to-one, and that's going to have an impact on whether the player feels like they are getting a similar kind of experience. We must realize the dangers of, say, the drastic changes in pacing, and take steps like limiting the scope of investigation to ensure that both the game design side, the act of playing the game in an enjoyable way, and the narrative design side, the feeling of solving a mystery, are both retained and balanced. Finally, I feel like we have to accept that the very salient, appealing tropes of detective fiction can be divorced from the act of solving mysteries, and we do not need to include game mechanics that encourage this type of play. You can have a game where you play as the world's greatest detective, Batman, and your role as the player is limited to watching them solve the mystery, being shocked by the twists as they do, like you would in a noir novel, for example. You may decide their fate in various other aspects of their life, like physical violence or personal decisions, I guess, and that's exactly what Telltale's Batman games do, and I find them the more enjoyable for it. As long as we are clear on what type of fun a particular game should provide, I think that both detective games and games that are simply about detectives can coexist. And until that time, I'll just play them all and find the ones I'm looking for either way. Thanks a lot for watching. If you enjoyed the video, I would be very happy if you left a sub or a like or maybe a nice comment. Those really help with growing the channel and making sure more people see the videos. So if you end up doing that, thanks a lot.